So the BCCLA has been the very happy beneficiary of ongoing collaboration and partnership with Amnesty International over the years. I have had the enormous privilege of working with Alex recently on matters relating to the transfer of detainees by Canadian forces in Afghanistan to torture and abuse. In 2005, when Canadian forces first began transferring prisoners to the custody of Afghan authorities, the BCCLA and Amnesty International called on Canada to work with the Afghan government and NATO allies to develop a system for handling detainees that would protect them and to ensure that prisoners would not be subject to torture and abuse. We saw this as an opportunity for Canada to assist Afghanistan in reforming its notorious prison system and to play an important role in furthering the goal of eradicating torture worldwide. By 2007, however, 2 years later, we saw little effort being made by the government to ensure that Afghan detainees were being treated humanely. And so we turned to the courts and tribunals for assistance. And there again, Amnesty and the BCCLA worked together, and we launched a federal court application for an order to halt the transfers. We also jointly filed 2 complaints with the Military Police Complaints Commission challenging the transfers. And in all of that work, the federal government has thrown up innumerable roadblocks along the way. Our federal court case was ultimately dismissed. And 5 years after our complaints were first filed with the MPCC, we are still awaiting the Commission's report, which we think is going to come out any day now, but we've been thinking that for quite some time. But in the meantime, the BCCLA and Amnesty have also engaged in a significant amount of joint advocacy relating to Canada's conduct in Afghanistan, from calling for a public inquiry into the detainee transfers to calling attention to the treatment of child soldiers being detained by Canadian forces. And throughout, Amnesty and Alex have proved to be the very best partners that one could hope for in doing this sort of work, smart, untiring, passionate, and savvy. Recently, the BCCLA partnered with Amnesty and Alex again in our advocacy concerning the Murdered and Missing Women's Inquiry here in British Columbia. And so we hope we will continue this tradition of collaboration and partnership for many years to come. So Alex, on behalf of the BCCLA, thank you for being here today and all that you have done. And for my part, thank you for your friendship and for being an endless source of inspiration. I'll hand things off over to Seth KLEIN now.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to have been asked to introduce Alex, but I've also been asked to say a little bit about the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. But let me, first of all, simply extend a warm, happy anniversary to the BCCLA. Thank you for all of your years of work. You are, without question, the most vibrant and impactful civil liberties association in Canada. You've been fearless and unrelenting and unwavering in your principles. And I think we owe you a great debt, and we at the CCPA are proud to have you as friends and partners and allies. Like the BCCLA, the CCPA sees as one of its core functions holding governments to account and protecting and reaffirming core Canadian values. 2012 marks our 15th anniversary here in British Columbia, and we feel like ours has been a good news story. 16 years ago, the CCPA really had very little presence in BC, about 100 members, not much profile in the media, no local office or staff, and I think public policies in this province, public policy debates were a lot less balanced. Today we have about 4,000 members in the province. We are regularly in the newspapers and on radio, although of course no NGO in BC holds a candle to you folks at the BCCLA when it comes to media profile. I work with a terrific team in the BC office of 14 people. We regularly give talks around the province and regularly publish original and much needed research. Some of you have heard me say this before, but research that we believe gives people permission to hope, to know that our aspirations for a better world stand on solid ground. Research that reaffirms that our best values are possible, that we can indeed take better care of one another when facing old age and poverty and illness and unemployment and disability and so many of the challenges that are a basic reality of our lives. Research that shows, indeed, that frequently we do this not only more equitably, but even more efficiently when we do that together, and that we can even fulfill these tasks even as we protect the environment and rise to the existential challenge of climate change. That's in essence what we do. I just want to mention a few pieces of our work that overlap with the work of the BCCLA. We serve as the Secretariat for the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. 4 years ago, we were pleased to have the BCCLA, along with about 300 organizations across the province, sign an open letter to all BC's political parties calling for a comprehensive poverty reduction plan. That coalition has been active ever since, building the call, and we are hopeful that we will soon win a plan with concrete targets and timelines. BC is now, of course, one of only 2 holdout provinces without such a plan, despite having the highest poverty rates in the country. The CCPA is the producer and repository of the most comprehensive income inequality research in Canada. Well before the Occupy movement rocketed the issue of inequality to the forefront of public discourse, for which we are grateful and awed, our organization was highlighting this phenomenon of the 1%, the breaking away of the wealthiest among us, and the corrosive impact this was having on social cohesion and democracy. Our flagship program in BC is the Climate Justice Project, a research and public engagement alliance which we co-host with UBC, which has been mapping out what this province will look like when it has become carbon zero by mid-century, but done so in a way that reduces inequality and ensures that the societal and industrial transitions before us unfold in a just manner. And a new project that we're just initiating, again, brings together a broad alliance. It's called the Trust in Government Project. And really all roads have led us here, whether it's mapping out the work of the Climate Justice Project or a comprehensive poverty reduction plan. What we consistently find is that we know the public policy solutions and the public wants it, but it comes up against this barrier of a fundamental lack of trust in government or in our collective capacity to rise to these challenges. And we're very pleased that the BCCLA has signed on as a partner in that new project. Like the BCCLA, we see as one vital aspect of our work training the next generation. And so like you, we pride ourselves on the level of student placements and training we provide. And in particular, we co-host an amazing youth leadership program called Next Up. The alumni of that program, as BCCLA board member Tom Sanborn has written about in the Tyee, are already providing fabulous and inspiring leadership across many NGOs in our community. In sum, our ties with the BCCLA are numerous. Dave Eby is one of our research associates and someone with whom we've collaborated since his days at Pivot Legal. In 2010, it was just mentioned, we were happy to co-publish an important study by Shannon Dobb with the BCCLA and working in particular with Michael, and co-published as well with the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, entitled Election Chill Effect, the Impact of BC's Third-Party Advertising Rules on Social Movement Groups. And while most of the public debate about this law focused on the spending ceilings and the impact on unions and corporations, this report highlighted a much less understood but insidious effect, namely how the lack of a spending floor and the outrageously broad terms of the law were effectively silencing smaller charities and NGOs and preventing them from sharing their insights during the election period, the very time when their very valuable opinions are most needed in a democracy. Nationally, the CCPA has been honored to have a relationship with Amnesty International, which brings me to Alex. 2 years ago, when the CCPA was celebrating its 30th anniversary since its national founding, we hosted a conference in Ottawa, and Alex was one of the featured speakers, and in my view, his talk was the most riveting and memorable. His speech, which we later published in our magazine, was entitled The Big Chill, and detailed all the ways in which freedom of speech and the essential advocacy work of civil society organizations is under siege by the federal government. Of course, that speech was 2 years ago, and the list of assaults and injuries is much longer now. I won't say more about the content of that speech. I suspect Alex will, but we are confronting a deeply troubling times when it comes to the voicing of dissent and the staggering lack of tolerance this federal government has for those institutions that deign to advance opinions not of their liking. But as we come together and push back to collectively refuse to be intimidated, Alex Neve has emerged as a clear voice and an important national leader. Alex has been Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada since the year 2000, and under his leadership, I think the role of Amnesty Canada has broadened in important ways. When I was a kid with my high school Amnesty chapter, you know, like many of you, we wrote our letters to various third world despots seeking to shine a light on human rights violations in other countries. And under Alex's leadership, that bread and butter work of Amnesty continues, and Alex continues to play an important role with Amnesty's work internationally. But Amnesty has become something more. It's challenged Canadians to confront the suppression of basic human rights in our own country. We saw this in the courageous role Alex played in defense of Maher Arar and others whose freedom was violated by our own government working hand in glove with torturous regimes, a role Alex assumed, it needs to be remembered, when it was deeply unpopular to do so, when most in Canada still falsely presumed Maher's guilt. We see this in the leadership role Alex played a couple years ago in the formation of Voices, Voix, a national coalition of NGOs that came together to push back against the Harper government's attempts to squash dissent. We saw just a couple days ago with this open letter that, of which Alex was one of the ringleaders, that was signed on to by dozens of organizations demanding that the federal government respect the work of UN rapporteurs. And we see it in Amnesty's role highlighting the denial of basic social and economic rights of First Nations in Canada, and more broadly in the campaign work Amnesty does linking poverty and human rights. And finally, we see it in Amnesty's research work dealing with Canadian mining companies abroad, pushing to ensure that they respect human rights in other countries. Don't know if that includes the one for which this theater is named. And in their research work, critiquing trade deals with countries like Colombia that routinely violate human rights. In short, Alex demands that we think broadly about human rights here at home and around the world. Alex holds law degrees from Dalhousie University and did a master's in international human rights law at the University of Essex. He was active with Amnesty for many years before becoming its Secretary General, and as a consultant with Amnesty International in London, with their international secretariat in the late 90s, Alex wrote a major report about protecting the human rights of displaced people. He's been a refugee counselor and has practiced immigration and refugee law in Ottawa. He is an officer of the Order of Canada, and we are honored to have him with us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Alex Neve.
Thank you ever so much, Seth, for that very kind introduction. I'm now dying to go out and look at the name of the theater. I didn't even notice where we are. What company is it? Oh, yikes. I've been misled. It's a pleasure, an absolute pleasure to be with you, and I'm so thrilled I've actually been able to be here for the entire day and hear those other wonderful presentations from four colleagues and friends and fellow activists and advocates who are doing such important work across, as you've heard, those of you who have been here for the day, such an important range of human rights concerns. I think it's really giving us an opportunity to get a rich and powerful sense of both the very serious human rights challenges we continue to face, be it in this province or nationally, but also the energy, the talent, the determination, the creativity that lies in our communities and is insistent and determined to advance the struggle and to absolutely not stay silent in the face of these glaring problems. 50. Is this good? Yeah. 50. You know, it's really a great number, isn't it? And you know, it's a number that I think no matter what context you use it in, 50 sounds important, doesn't it? It just carries this great sense of significance. And it truly has been a number that's been in the air a lot lately. My own organization, Amnesty International, in fact, just last week, wrapped up a very eventful and busy full year of marking our own 50th anniversary. We're near contemporaries. Goes back to a spring day in May 1961 in London when a British barrister who was outraged about the unjust imprisonment of 2 university students during the years of cruel military dictatorship in Portugal, set out to harness voices of what he felt would be similar outrage around the world and turn them into a collective force for human rights change. Well, that's just over 50 years ago as well. 50 matters to me personally, as well as it is the landmark age I turned just last week. So there you go, another contemporary to the BCCLA. On May 24th, in fact, the same birthday as, get this, Queen Victoria and Bob Dylan. Could you ask for a more eclectic human rights mix, eh? And to put my own 50 years of longevity into some sort of perspective, I take heart in noting that 2012 is also, I assume many of you know this, the 50th anniversary year for both the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys. 50, or I suppose more correctly, 50, has of course become a very significant civil liberties number, hasn't it, in Quebec, as 50 is now the culpable threshold set in the province's notorious and contentious Bill 78, over which protesters are required to provide advance notice of any public demonstration. So 50 is good. 51, and you break the law. But of course, most significantly, the number 50 is front and center today as we mark a half-century of the vitally important, hard-hitting, and unflinching human rights and civil liberties work of this fine organization, close ally of Amnesty's, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. So I want to begin, therefore, with my own words of tribute to an organization that has made absolutely such a tremendous difference in shoring up the rights and freedoms, not only of British Columbians, but of all Canadians for 5 decades now, and has done so across a wide range of fundamental issues going to the very heart of human dignity, integrity, and well-being. As one small reflection of that tremendously good work, I think of the close partnerships that Amnesty International has had with BCCLA during the past decade, touching upon, I would say, some of the most challenging and pressing human rights concerns our nation has faced over those years. We worked together in 2 judicial inquiries that delved into the troubling world of Canadian complicity in the overseas torture of Meher Arar, Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed Abu al-Mati, and Muyad Nuruddin in Syria and Egypt. Both inquiries forced us to face some ugly realities in Canada and underscored in very human ways that when human rights are sold short in the name of security, both human rights and security are ultimately undermined and imperiled. We, of course, as Carmen has reminded us, struggled together long and hard, still do, over many years to put the disconcerting issue of battlefield prisoner transfers in Afghanistan in front of Canadians. We turned to government, we turned to the courts, we turned to Parliament, we turned to a complaints commission, we turned to the media, we turned to the public. Of course, we never imagined that along the way we would be unleashing firestorms that would bring down a cabinet minister, push a government to prorogue Parliament, and provoke a near-constitutional crisis. All we set out to do was to stand firm for the crucial, unconditional ban on torture. And we did, and I think there's much we should be proud of in that work. We began the debate, we shed light, we forced improvements in how the government was handling prisoners. And as Carmen noted, we still await more with the release of the report soon of the lengthy hearings conducted by the Military Police Complaints Commission. Now, there is the little footnote here, of course, of the troubling precedent set with a federal court ruling that the Charter doesn't apply to our own troops once they leave Canada. But we will come back to that. Our organizations have the tenacity and certainty, and we will look for the right time, the right issue, the right moment to come back to that, because we need to be sure, ultimately, that that precedent does not stand. We can't let it stand. As a late-breaking update on that, some of you may know that earlier today, the UN Committee Against Torture released its review of Canada's record of complying with obligations under the Convention Against Torture, the committee's first review of Canada in 7 years. They have called on Canada to amend domestic law to make it possible to enforce extraterritorial jurisdiction over torture-related cases in Canadian courts. They have also called on Canada to adopt a policy on military prisoner transfers that does not rely on promises and monitoring arrangements to do an end run around the obligation not to hand someone over to a serious risk of torture. Together, BCCLA and Amnesty have been among only a handful of organizations in the country that highlighted concerns about the poorly regulated, inadequately studied, and unquestioning embrace of taser guns by police forces across the country over the past decade. That came, of course, to such a tragic head with the killing of Robert Jakanski at Vancouver Airport 5 years ago. But then the subsequent and very important Braidwood inquiry, in the aftermath of which we are finally seeing the taser love affair cool down for some, but not all, police forces in Canada, with fewer officers authorized to carry them or higher thresholds of threat set for taser use. But we still do not have consistent standards that apply across the country. Both of our organizations have actively taken up the case of Omar Khadr through Supreme Court interventions and other efforts. In 2010, I traveled down to Guantanamo Bay 3 times. It's quite a journey, let me tell you, and watched his Kafkaesque journey through the injustice of a military commission trial. Now, we know that Omar Khadr's transfer back to a Canadian prison is likely imminent. But that certainly will not mark the end of that very important human rights struggle. There will most certainly be more work for us ahead to ensure that the serious and lingering human rights violations he has endured, including torture and ill treatment and the failure to treat him as a child soldier, will finally be addressed. And judging by the long and very sorry track record to date, the government will not take those steps on its own volition, and we will once again, I am sure, have to turn to judges to ensure that Omar Khadr's rights are upheld. Both of our organizations are preparing to possibly intervene in another important case, once again, a case that seeks to remind governments that nothing justifies torture. Hassan Diab is facing extradition to France on charges going back to a 1980 synagogue bombing in Paris, which he denies. The evidence is, to say the least, thin, and at the heart of it is very real concern that the French are likely relying on information that they received from the Syrians, we've heard a bit about them lately, who in turn would have obtained it a number of years ago through torture. The Canadian government argues it's not their affair, and it is for the French government to sort out any worries about torture-tainted evidence. We say that torture is every government's business. And then, of course, we have joined together, along with many other organizations, large and small, here in British Columbia, any number of whom I'm sure are here with us today, in campaigning for an inquiry to be convened to examine in full the issues surrounding not only the horrors of the Picton pig farm, but the wider and long-standing crisis of murdered and missing women, particularly Aboriginal women, in this city and this province. Together, we welcomed the provincial government's decision to set up the Missing Women Inquiry, and a time, I think, that was filled with a sense of hope, optimism, and expectation. We forged ahead with plans to participate actively, along with the Pivot Legal Society, as a small but mighty intervening coalition. But you know the story, don't you? Because, of course, we then found ourselves again together, walking away from what had become an unfair, one-sided, deeply biased inquiry that has betrayed the very communities with the greatest interest in its outcome and deepened the very injustices and inequities that it is tasked with exploring and addressing. Oh my, the ups and the downs of human rights work. Well, for all of that work and so much more, we at Amnesty International are so deeply grateful for the BCCLA at 50. And it is sad, but very true to say that in these times, friends, we need the BCCLA and its vigilance, its principles, its leadership, likely more than we have in quite some time. We need BCCLA because on many fronts these days, Canada's long tradition of being both a domestic and global human rights champion is slipping precipitously. Over the BCCLA's 50 years, a truly impressive culture of protecting and believing in human rights took hold in Canada. It's almost been a matter of going from 0 to 50 over that span. It's played out domestically, for it's over those 5 decades that our federal, provincial, and territorial human rights acts and commissions and tribunals were put in place, and of course, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms adopted. Globally, it is over those 5 decades that Canada has worked to develop the concept of UN peacekeeping, lead the world in protecting Indo-Chinese refugees, stand up to our US and UK allies in saying no to apartheid, develop international treaties dealing with landmines and child soldiers, and push other governments to establish, along with us, the International Criminal Court. But those laurels lie further and further in the past. And more recently, Canada, the country of fabled human rights leadership, has far too frequently now become Canada, the country of human rights disappointment and even obstruction. I've already touched on a number of areas of concern in that quick tour of some of the common cause Amnesty and BCCLA have found in recent years. Those are domestic human rights concerns, but with global resonance. And Canada's shortcomings, and I assure you, Canada's failure to address those shortcomings, be it with respect to torture and national security, treatment of prisoners in the midst of war, or protecting Indigenous women and girls from violence, all of that has been noted on the world stage. You've heard more examples from today's other speakers, including the government's insistence on defending its disgraceful, indefensible, discriminatory treatment of First Nations children through that unending series of hearings and appeals before various commissions, tribunals, and courts. And there are other worrying examples, a whole series of dots that need to be connected. Let me just touch on 4 deeply troubling instances. The first is a range of concerns associated with Canadian refusal to embrace a vision of strengthened protection of economic, social, and cultural rights, to acknowledge that rights to health care, education, housing are as deserving of strong protection as rights to free expression, fair trials, or to be protected from torture. Perhaps most notoriously, Canada has adamantly refused to support groundbreaking resolutions adopted recently at both the UN General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council, laying out the steps that governments should take to better protect the right to water. The reason for withholding that support? Canada remains unconvinced that a right to water even exists in the first place. Water. I mean, what comes closer to being the very essence of what it is to sustain life? Safe, clean, accessible water that Cindy reminded us this morning is illusory in so many First Nations communities across Canada. This is playing out again right now, and I literally mean right now, friends, with Canada leading efforts to ensure that no reference at all to the right to water will make its way into the outcome document of the Rio +20 Earth Summit on Sustainable Development to be held in Brazil later this month. Those words, right to water, Canada is determined, will not be in that document. This antipathy and hostility for economic, social, and cultural rights was on full display last month in the petulant and embarrassing attacks the government launched against the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, respected Belgian professor Olivier de Schutter, at the close of his 10-day mission to Canada. A mission carried out, I must add, further to an invitation from the Government of Canada. He was ridiculed for coming to Canada at all, a wealthy democratic country which in the government's view apparently has no problems at all in ensuring that all people have sufficient healthy food. But he was also attacked personally, called arrogant, academic, ill-informed, patronizing, by not one, not two, not three, by 4 cabinet ministers caught up in what almost seemed to be a bloodlust frenzy in question period in the House of Commons. They were up on their feet applauding each other as each minister added more pejoratives to the heap. That's our Canada? And what does it buy us anyway? Because at the end of the day, what we've done is we've shown the rest of the world that the best way to deal with a troublesome UN human rights expert lies through disrespect and insults. Why bother responding to the message when you can instead savage the messenger? Amnesty, the BCCLA, and over 100 other Canadian organizations, including the organizations many of our speakers represent, Cindy's organization, Kim Pate's organization, the ICLMG, which Maureen has led, have asked Prime Minister Harper to apologize to Professor de Schutter and to publicly confirm that his government not only recognizes but welcomes UN-level human rights scrutiny as an integral part of shoring up human rights protection both in Canada and globally. As a footnote here, I guess I can only imagine the kind of conversation there's been around the cabinet table today with the release of the UN Committee Against Torture's report. Next, I want to say a few things about the death penalty. I'm sure you're all going to scratch your head and wonder why I'm even raising it. We're an abolitionist country. We all know that. The last execution in Canada was, actually wait for it, here comes that number again, 50 years ago. Or at least 50 years this coming December. The death penalty was abolished in Canadian law 36 years ago. And that strong stand domestically against the death penalty has been matched internationally by leadership as more and more states have moved to abolish the death penalty as well. For instance, year after year, Canada not only voted in favor of, but went further and demonstrated leadership by co-sponsoring resolutions within the UN Commission on Human Rights, calling for abolition of the death penalty around the world. Then in 2007, 2008, and 2010, the most significant UN-level abolition effort yet was launched, a resolution before the entire General Assembly calling for a worldwide moratorium on executions. It was risky. No one really knew how the votes were going to fall out, and if ever there was a time for leadership, this was it. And it came. That leadership came from many corners, some unexpected. But from Canada, not at all, and instead Canada stepped back. While we did vote for the resolutions, and they did carry each of those years, Canada refused to co-sponsor every single time. The only firmly abolitionist country in the world to refuse to co-sponsor, the only country with a well-established past track record of co-sponsorship that refused to maintain that stance. At the same time, the government took an end run on our commitment to abolition in late 2007 by announcing, not in the House of Commons where you might expect it, but mainly through press scrums and statements, that we would no longer seek clemency on behalf of Canadian citizens who are sentenced to death in countries we consider to be democratic. This was undoing several decades of consistently seeking clemency in such cases. The government clearly had in their sights Ronald Smith, a Canadian citizen who has been on death row in Montana for more than 25 years now. It took a federal court order to force Canada to reverse the reversal and support Ron Smith's clemency efforts. And 6 months ago, we saw the result. 4 full paragraphs, fitting easily on one page, which open by noting that the federal court has, quote, ordered the government to support Mr. Smith's case for clemency. Could have perhaps been just a tad more heartfelt. Then there's been the rights of Indigenous peoples. I've talked already about violence against Indigenous women, and you've heard so passionately this morning from Cindy about Indigenous children. The rights of Indigenous peoples is absolutely, by any measure, one of the most serious and widespread human rights concerns worldwide, certainly so domestically within Canada. And for decades, it was one of the most notable gaps in the UN human rights system. For more than 20 years, states and Indigenous peoples organizations labored through fractured and often very contentious negotiations, drafting a new declaration that would elaborate the rights of Indigenous peoples and set out a framework for their protection. Finally, wording was agreed, and it was ready to come to a vote before the new UN Human Rights Council in June 2006. In fact, the Council's first substantive piece of business. And Canada was leading the charge, right? Precisely the contrary, implacably opposed. And not only opposed, but determined to aggressively set out to convince other countries to oppose it as well, to see the defeat of this important new declaration. To little avail, fortunately, as only 3 countries stood alongside Canada in opposition at the final UN General Assembly vote in 2007, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, all of which have now reversed their opposition. And so finally, and palpably reluctantly, Canada too followed suit and announced in November 2010 that it would no longer oppose the declaration, but not with any sense of seriousness. No public announcements, no photo op with Aboriginal leaders, certainly not like the United States, where President Obama had resolutely and very publicly endorsed the declaration with key U.S. tribal leaders at his side. Instead, a public statement was quietly circulated at 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, a tried and true strategy to bury the story. And 18 months later, there is still not a shred of evidence that the government meant it. No action plan for implementing the declaration's terms, no efforts to promote or champion it on the world stage. Now, lastly, I want to come to the whole troubling area that Seth has referred to, and that is the siege underway in Canada against civil society, dissent, and advocacy. It is becoming a long and sorry catalogue. Status of women funding rules changed so that groups advocating for protection of women's human rights, horror, are no longer supported. The Court Challenges program discontinued, cutting off one of the most important avenues, in fact, for many, the only avenue by which Charter of Rights court cases have been brought forward on behalf of society's most marginalized and disenfranchised. Outspoken heads of important oversight bodies charged with monitoring government conduct in areas where human rights and the public interest are very much on the line have been fired or not renewed in their positions because they have stood up to or disagreed too forcefully with government on a number of crucial issues. Or they've been done away with simply to save money, such as the announcement buried deep within the recent federal budget that the Inspector General of CSIS is to be shut down to save a whopping $1 million. There's been the arbitrary and punitive funding decisions that have devastated a growing number of organizations, with this as the common thread, a solidifying government policy now not to fund organizations engaged in advocacy and research as opposed to service delivery. The list of organizations affected, many of which have been advancing important social and public agendas for decades, is actually now simply far too long to even begin to recount to you. There's the crisis that has destroyed the once globally respected, truly so, parliamentary agency, Rights and Democracy, rooted in a conflict generated by government-appointed board members about low levels of funding provided to 3 well-respected Israeli-Palestinian human rights groups, culminating in the government's announcement earlier this year of the agency's closure. Human rights commissions and tribunals are increasingly vulnerable, their work increasingly attacked as intrusive and illegitimate. What is happening in Saskatchewan? Tribunal disbanded, commission dramatically slashed, may be a very worrying canary, friends, in the human rights coal mine. The crackdowns on popular dissent and protest, the G20 summit in 2010 and now on the streets of Montreal, and even more troubling, the absolute refusal of any level of government to take responsibility and ensure accountability for those excesses and abuses. And then there is the hostility, over-the-top rhetoric, and menacing warning shots directed at the environmental advocacy community as of late, particularly in that fine piece of Democracy and Good Governance in Action, the 400-plus page budget bill. I do hope that everyone here who runs or is associated with a website or is present on Facebook or active on Twitter will be joining in the Day of Solidarity this coming Monday. Blackout, speak out. We certainly will. All of this points to some very troubling trends, and it's going to take me just a little more than 30 seconds to get them out. First, there's what I have started to refer to as the "you are with us" or "you are evil" orthodoxy. You either obediently agree with government policy or initiatives, or you risk vilification and near public flogging. Many of us have experienced it. Prisoner transfers in Afghanistan, torture in Afghanistan. Well, you're either with the government on that, or you are a passionate supporter of the Taliban. Online surveillance legislation and privacy concerns, you are with the government, or you are an advocate for pedophiles and the abuse of children. Northern Gateway Pipeline, you are with the government, or you are a traitor to your country, a virtual eco-terrorist accountable only to the demands of your foreign funder and puppet master. Then there's the emerging insistence that charity must mean silence and compliance. The statements and initiatives coming out of the federal budget make that very clear. For charities, advocacy is a peril like never before. To feed the poor or to clean up an environmental mess is charity. But dare ask challenging questions about the roots of poverty or question the economic and political choices that cause environmental disasters in the first place, and you will be castigated. And it's, of course, become very clear that in the midst of all of this, those most at risk, as always, are the most marginalized. The brunt of this siege is not felt by the business community or the middle class. The brunt of this falls squarely on the shoulders of those living in poverty, Indigenous peoples, women, the homeless, people living with disabilities, children, the elderly. Witness the staggering cuts. I know it's been hard to pay attention to everything that's been happening in that budget, but the staggering cuts to funding in the recent budget for a range of Indigenous health promotion and advocacy programs run out of pretty well all of the national Aboriginal organizations, and for many of those organizations, it's meant that those programs have completely disappeared now. So the struggle certainly does continue, my friends, doesn't it? And let's be clear about what is at stake, because this isn't just about shifting priorities and approaches as one government's agenda gives way to the next. In fact, this isn't about politics. This is about ideology, and that's new for us as Canadians. What we are witnessing is a systematic onslaught against bedrock principles, principles that we certainly see in the 5-decades-old vision and commitment that has been at the very heart of the BCCLA's mission. That it is in our common interests to ensure that all voices are able to be heard on crucial issues. That we are not a nation founded or built on some sense of orthodoxy and ideology or on notions of compliance and conformity. We're a nation of diversity and debate with a core belief in rights and justice. We are a people that believes in multilateralism, in all of its imperfections. We are a country that stands for the common good. And I know everyone in this room will agree with me that we cannot and we will not, we most certainly will not stand by and watch as any of that is taken apart. So onward from 50, BCCLA friends and supporters. Onward strong and true and determined, because do we ever need you? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alex, for that very, very powerful call to arms. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, and so we'll do the usual. Let me just start from the back and move on forward.
Thank you, Mr. Neve. It has been a very, very inspirational and informative talk, and you really lay out the reality of our society, our democracy, our sense of human dignity, rights. They're suffering from more than 1,000 cuts. I don't know whether that our society, our democracy, our system going to be caused by this death by 1,000 cuts, but certainly it's very close to it. So my question to you and to the BCCLA and other organizations is that, I'm thinking about like the situation of Oliver Twist in Charles Dickens' novel, when Oliver Twist and go up to Mr. Bumble and says, "Sir, small soup, I'm still hungry." So what would you advise us as well as your organizations, BCCLA, things like that, are going to do about the situation to eliminate the problem? Are we going to just try to appeal to Mr. Bumble for today's that have a more humanitarian, a human right approach to all of this and give them more soup? Or actually, we're going to say that this kind of system, this kind of situation cannot permit, and we should change the system change. Because as a student of history, I am told by history that the kind of democracy, the system of democracy that we enjoy today, parliamentary democracy and things like that. Yes. Oh, okay. Started as the end result of the English Civil War of 1640, which set the action in motion of getting the English crown to surrender the power of government to Parliament, to the people. But as Thomas Hobbes, one of the three architects of the social contract, the political philosophy that which democracy stated, in summarizing the experience of the Civil War, and he put it in his book, The Bohemians, at the end of it, and he said one thing, and I quote, "We will not have peace until that the ministers of the crown, the elected officials, understands the power they exercise must be not any more than what the people allows them to do." So what I'm going to say is that what are we going to allow our government, our public figures, the power that could govern our society?
Okay, thank you. Well, you have asked the right guy, because I have to begin by telling you that at the age of 12, growing up in Calgary, I was the most plaintive, heartbreaking Oliver Twist you can possibly imagine. And if anyone buys me enough drinks later, I'll sing "Where Is Love" for you. I appreciate very much the tone and sort of the longing in your question of what do we do. That I'm glad that sort of my message, which I think is one that many are conveying right now in a whole variety of different settings across the country, that these are serious times. These are not just irksome or difficult trends. These are troubling, fundamentally troubling trends that are starting to play out in our nation, and that we have to respond. And I think we could spend like 3 hours talking about various strategies and tactics. What I think I would highlight above all else, though, taking it up to a very big sort of level, is we have to get together. And I think that's happening in many respects. I think the powerful initiative around the Blackout Speak Out initiative this coming Monday is a great example of that. Seth, in his opening comments, talked about the work that Amnesty International and a number of other organizations have been involved in over the last couple of years to bring together now something like 200 organizations, large and small, across the country in the Voices Coalition, which is very much focusing on that whole trend of the very many ways in which voices are being shut down and silenced, punished, defunded, derided, fired, insulted, you name it. And we've got a long ways to go. These are communities. Working across sectors has not necessarily always been a common trend in Canada, maybe because there hasn't been a sense of urgency or need for that. I think within issue areas, there's been tremendous coalition. Within the human rights and civil liberties world, I've been praising and talking about the great collaboration Amnesty's had with BCCLA and with other human rights groups across the country. You could say the same thing in the environmental community, the women's movement, etc. But really, I think for the first time now, we're seeing the incredible need to bring all of those sectors together because it's playing out a little bit differently everywhere, but the storyline is absolutely the same. And the forces that are playing out against us are so strong and so determined that unless we find the ways to bring our efforts together and stand together, we won't make headway at all. So that's, I think, the big message I would share. The strategy, the tactics are things that are sort of out there and available through a number of organizations, whether it's the specific things that should be done to respond to the current budget bill or some of the other initiatives. And I mean, I guess the other big message is be active. And I'm sure you are. I'm sure everyone in this room is. But be active and get other people active as well. We all can be emissaries and ambassadors around this stuff. Some of it isn't stuff that necessarily resonates once you get out beyond the usual circles. And we need to find ways to bring this story about what's at stake, what we're losing, and how we all stand to suffer out to small communities right across the country, to all neighborhoods, and really get Canadians understanding what's at stake.
And I think we have time for one more question here.
Alex, thanks for your comments. I hope in your second 50 years you find something you're excited and passionate about.
I'm working on it. Oliver,
my grandson who sang the role recently would love to do a duet with you, I'm sure. Two quick questions. Can you tell us the specific logistics involved in participating in the Blackout Speak Out event on Monday? And secondly, if you have the addresses of any of these deep-pocketed funders you were referring to, I wonder if you'd make them available. I joined the movement 50 years ago, told that I'd have money from Moscow, and it still hasn't arrived.
When, of course, we're no longer concerned about Moscow, we're concerned about Palo Alto and Seattle and all of those meddling, wealthy Americans who are controlling our sort of advocacy agendas up here in Canada. I wish I had at the top of, I should be able to put it up there on the screen. Maybe there is someone here who knows the website you should go to. It would be nice if it was something as simple as blackoutspeakout.ca, and I think I've seen that URL in that kind of, but we can certainly, I'll get word about that, or others can get word about that back to BCCLA friends, and maybe there's a way to get that information out widely to people who have, do we? Oh, okay. So there you go. So the website itself is blackoutspeakout.ca, and to get information, it's just info@.
I'm sorry, I think that we're out of time, but thank you so much, Alex.
Okay.
And I think
I'm finally a member.
Before we break, just a few last words. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today. Those who stayed for a little gained not quite as much as those who stayed for a lot. But I think that the exchange of views, listening to the very passionate voices that we heard today of people who have become literally stars in their respective spheres, I think that it has been just a wonderful session, very well planned and organized. I'll repeat again to all of the staff who were involved in that. I'd like to thank each and every one of the speakers who came and who addressed us. And because we seem to have gotten off on a little bit of a poetic binge, I have to say I didn't quite know what was going to come when I quoted from Yeats about dreams this morning, but it seemed to fit. I'll take something from Robbie Burns, who wrote The Tree of Liberty. And just two stanzas, but the first one, heard ye the tree of France? I wotna what the name it. Around the tree the patriots dance, while Europe kens the fame it. It stands where ance the Bastille stood, a prison built by king's man, when superstition's hellish brood kept France in leading strings, man. And later he calls for each of us to think on what we can do to plant trees of liberty in our own areas. With plenty of sick tree, I trow, the world would live in peace, man. The sword would help to make a plough. The din of war would cease, man. Like brethren in a common cause, we'd on each other smile, man, and equal rights and equals laws would gladden every isle, man. Thank you all for coming. All the best. See you 50 years from now.